Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 10 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Utah Hockey Club and won by a score of 5-4 in overtime. You know, I didn't think I'd have to bust out the party hat and the noisemaker for any game this season. Last year I did it a couple times because the Sharks had an 11-game losing streak and a 12-game losing streak. However, with this season having opened up with 9 losses in a row, getting this first win here in Game 10, preventing the double-digit losing streak to open the season for a second straight year, it felt like a cause for celebration as the Sharks complete this miraculous comeback against the NHL's newest team. Now, what was very interesting about this one is that if you actually go back to Game 1 of the regular season against the St. Louis Blues, that game the Sharks held a 4-1 lead going into the third period before giving up 3 unanswered in that final frame, going into overtime and losing out to St. Louis. And that was the beginning of this 9-game losing streak. And so for it to end with this parallel type of scenario where instead it is the Sharks trailing 4-1 going into the third period, they themselves scoring 3 unanswered and then winning in overtime is quite the mirrored type of situation. And I've done my research here. Considering that St. Louis Blues game was the beginning of a 9-game losing streak, we can only conclude that this Utah Hockey Club game is the beginning of a 9-game winning streak. I will not hear any arguments against that. That is the scientific method applied to its absolute perfect potential, but I think the Sharks may very well go on a real heater now because that's just the way the hockey gods work, right? Anyway, getting into how this game played out, it obviously didn't start as the Sharks were hoping for. While they did manage to prevent themselves falling in a 3-goal deficit in the opening period of a third straight game, it was not really that much better, as instead it was a 2-goal deficit as they gave up one to Gunther and another to Michelli to put them down 2-0 heading into the second period. That is where Fabian Zetterlund would get a goal to bring it to within 1. A bit of hope generated for the Sharks, but almost the very shift after, it is Michelli's second of the game to put the Utah Hockey Club back ahead by 2, and then eventually in the dying seconds of the second period, Sergachev makes it 4-1, and that is the score heading into the third. And so I do not blame the Sharks fans who may have been watching this game and had seen the team lose 9 in a row to think that this game was pretty much over. I was amongst those Sharks fans believing that, and for the first 15 minutes of this third period, while the Sharks were playing better and they were playing fine in general, this game was actually relatively well played by San Jose. It seemed as though we were heading into another loss into the column of, well, at least they played kind of well, which is a moral victory that the Sharks no longer want to face this season. However, in the last 5 minutes of this third period, the stars aligned. The hockey gods looked down upon the San Jose Sharks, and a little light shone through the dark clouds that had gathered over them over these first 9 games of the season. All of the bad bounces and bad luck that the Sharks had sustained over these first few weeks all came back here in terms of good luck for San Jose. A shot by Granlund hits off of Zetterlund in front and gets past the Utah Hockey Club goaltender to make it 4-2. Then it is a seeing eye shot from Granlund again from the very same area of the ice that made it 4-3. And then it is a Toffoli shot in which he really kind of fans on this, but it is enough to fool Ingram and just barely get under his pad, and that ends up tying the game. And then in the overtime, that luck does still manage to carry through. The Sharks do draw a power play off of very good work by both Granlund and Eklund on an overtime shift, and then it is a shot from Granlund, again from a very similar area, that deflects off the backboards, jumps right in front for Wenberg to stuff home, and the Sharks get their first win of the season. Moving on to the players to talk about, obviously the notable disappearance here of Will Smith, who gets yet another development day off. Won't focus too much on this because I did make a video posted a few hours ago, in case you want to check that out, where I discussed the situation with Will Smith, but just to make a note that he was not playing here tonight. Also, Ty Dellandrea not in the lineup, likely due to the injury that he sustained in the previous game. While he had managed to return and play the rest of that game against Vegas, it seems as though there was maybe a little bit more there than originally thought, so he does not play here tonight, which means the Sharks have a couple of their extra forwards having to step in, and so it was not a lineup that inspired a lot of confidence. We start off with the top line. It remained as Eklund, Granlund, and Toffoli, and for the first couple of periods here, this line simply was just not really doing much for San Jose. This is the line that has to carry the brunt of the Sharks' offensive pressure, simply because, like I said, the rest of the lineup isn't inspiring a ton of confidence, and in the first 40 minutes it didn't really do that, and then in the last 5 minutes of this game it absolutely did. We start off here with Mikael Granlund, who of course has continued to just put up point after point, goal after goal for the San Jose Sharks. He ends up with 3 goals here in these last few minutes, including the overtime, and he really took over this game. His play in the 6-on-5 situation for the Sharks, and in particular on his overtime shift, were just absolutely dominant. You can tell Mikael Granlund did not want to go with that 10th loss to start this season, and so incredibly impressive to do that. Incredibly impressive to see him do that work. Of course, you still want to see a full 60 minutes from the San Jose Sharks, and that starts with this top line that we definitely didn't see that from here tonight. And so while there is a lot of positives here for Mikael Granlund, and in general, how can you be upset with the dominant performance he showed off in those last few minutes, gathering those 3 points? You hope that you could see that a little bit earlier in the first and the second. The same goes for his 2 teammates. While they certainly weren't as apparent as Mikael Granlund and as much shining there to do in those last few minutes, still really solid. Eklund's work off the face-off to help get this puck from that, because Alex Wennberg winning the faceoff with the help of William Eklund coming in is what led to these couple of Sharks goals actually in these last few minutes of the third period. He also was quite good on that overtime shift, managing to draw the penalty by going to the net, forcing the Utah Hockey Club defenseman to take that one. That gave the Sharks the 4-on-3. So very impressive end for Eklund, but similar criticism in the fact that he didn't start this game all that well. And then the same very mirrored belief here for Tyler Toffoli. He was probably the least effective on this line and when it came to those last few minutes, but he scores a goal. You can't necessarily be that upset. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, unlike the first line that did kind of struggle through the first couple of periods, this second line was likely the best for San Jose throughout this entire game until the last 5 minutes, where obviously things got turned on its head. Fabian Zetterlund was actually one of the very, very few standout forwards for San Jose in their previous game against Vegas. I had pointed that out, that Zetterlund actually looked pretty good. And as I mentioned a bit earlier on with Granlund, who seemed to just refuse to lose in this game, Zetterlund, very much the same thing. He scored the only goal for San Jose in the first 40 minutes of this one with a tremendous power move towards the net. He also is a big part of the Sharks' comeback effort in those last 5 minutes, so definitely give it to Zetterlund. He may have been probably the second best forward for the Sharks tonight, because Granlund likely wins out in that area, but still very nice night for him. When it comes to the other winger on this line, we have Danil Gushchin, who I was also incredibly impressed with. Now, he obviously did not get to be on the ice for the 6-on-5 situation, so he didn't get to play a direct role in the happy times occurring in those last few minutes. It was a 6-on-5 situation with Eklund, Granlund, Toffoli, Zetterlund, Wennberg, and Jake Wallman. So he was kind of like the 7th man in that situation, but still, throughout this game, I thought Gushchin was really impressive. He probably had a good 2 to 3 really solid chances in those first 40 minutes to actually be able to get a goal. Couple times robbed by Ingram, couple times didn't really get the prime shot off, but still definitely one of Gushchin's better games of the season. I really liked him in this role. When it comes to Alex Wennberg, he also, as I said, played a role in that comeback performance at the end. He was very important in being able to win those faceoffs. I imagine the major reason for why Wennberg is on the ice instead of Danil Gushchin in this 6-on-5 is because the Sharks do have faith in Wennberg to be able to win those faceoffs, which is exactly what he managed to do. So he gets the benefit of being there, and he also scores the overtime winner, which is obviously a big plus. Again, in that situation to win the faceoff, though I don't actually believe he did. He may have. I can't recall exactly, but still, nice enough game from Alex Wennberg. He was a little bit quiet at the start of this one when both Zetterlund and Gushchin seemed to be rolling, but he brought it back at the end. Then we get to the Sharks' third line. This is kind of where the lineup for San Jose obviously falls apart a bit. Will Smith, as I mentioned, day off here, so he's not in the lineup. Ty Dellandrea, who has likely been the most effective of those bottom 6 types of players for the San Jose Sharks, also not in the lineup here tonight. So Sharks looking a little bit thin in this part of their lineup. They actually, in a way, load up, I guess, so to speak, on their third line when it comes to their bottom 6 guys, as Goodrow and Cunnin end up placed with Carl Grundstrom. I actually didn't hate this line. I don't think they were great, and they did have a couple of shaky defensive zone shifts for sure, but all things considered, it wasn't the worst game from these three players. Grundstrom had very up and down moments. There were times where he was rather invisible. Then he had a couple of good shifts. Then he had a few really bad shifts near the end of the game. That kind of got him some ice time suffered. Like he lost a lot of ice time near the end because of that. We also saw in the 6-on-5 situation, I mentioned the 6 players on the ice. When the Sharks actually wanted to rest that group, they sent on a line of Goodrow, Cunnin, and Danil Gushin. So we saw Grundstrom replaced in that area, and not a surprise there because he, like I said, very up and down. But when it comes to Cunnin and Goodrow, they actually had a couple of good looks in this game. Both in the first period had really good slot chances that ended up getting robbed on. Goodrow actually had a very good chance as well a bit later on top of that. So again, not the worst games from these players, not the best either, but I'd say average enough to perhaps be able to maintain a spot in the lineup moving forward, of course. Then we get to the Sharks' fourth line. You know, with all the positives and the excitement and the happiness of the Sharks managing to make the comeback, that is going to overshadow slightly the disastrous performance that this fourth line actually put up. They had very, very few ice time. I think Giovanni Smith didn't crack 4 minutes. Kostin was up at maybe 5.5 to 6 minutes of ice time, and yet they still somehow, in that little amount of time, ended up being the 2 worst forwards on the San Jose Sharks for this game. To see the Sharks get that goal from Fabian Zetterlund, have a bit of life injected into them, and then to have this fourth line come on the ice pretty much immediately after, and then just have the worst of the worst shifts ever of all time pretty much, and give up this goal to Matias Maccelli that made it 3-1 Utah, that was pretty much the end of the night almost. I mean, I think they got one more shift, but that was more or less the end of the night for both Smith and Klim Kostin. I actually thought it was interesting because Kostin started this game off really poorly. His first period, he had maybe 2-3 shifts, really bad, but then his first shift of the second period was actually kind of good, and even set up Giovanni Smith for a decent chance in front, but then the wheels came off there on that particular shift that gave up that third goal, and it's the type of inconsistencies that have really plagued Kostin all season, and it's just, he's the type of player that you simply cannot trust when sending him out on the ice. So I had said that earlier, a few games ago, was likely the last that we had seen of Klim Kostin. Now that this road trip has ended, and this game was so really bad for him, it really feels as though that we've come to the end of the line at this point. I would be extremely surprised if Kostin manages to find his way into the lineup again for San Jose. Realistically, the Sharks should make at least one call-up or 2, and depending on who gets healthy, to prevent this from ever having to happen once more. The same would go for Giovanni Smith. While I don't think he was as terrible in terms of awful giveaways compared to Klim Kostin, he also was kind of bad, didn't really do much, managed to get into a fight, which I guess is a note. No, I wouldn't even necessarily call it a positive, but it is something to note compared to his first game of the season against the Jets, where he literally did nothing. Here tonight, he does get into a fight with Liam O'Brien, but besides that, and besides the one decent chance that I mentioned earlier, not really much doing here. He also is likely seeing his last game as a San Jose Shark, if I had to guess, and hopefully so. And then when it comes to the kind of odd man out here on this fourth line, Nico Sturm, you know, you're playing with 2 players that had really, really bad nights. It's hard to put a ton of blame onto Sturm, but I will say his coverage on the Maccelli goal was not the greatest, and so there is still definitely some work to be done for him. When it comes to the defensive side of things, we have Wallman and Ceci, who I actually thought looked somewhat shaky at times here tonight. I did like that Ceci looked a little bit more involved. This was a big criticism that I had for him over these last few games, that he wasn't jumping up into the play as much as he had previously been doing in the first 3 games of the season. I do think he really tried in that area here tonight. Didn't have a ton of success there, but I'd still say there were some small improvements where previously he had been trending downwards like this. To see a slight move upwards is a bit nice. Jake Wallman, he was a part of that last 5 minutes that allowed for that Sharks comeback, so I'll give him credit in that area, but his early parts of this game were not super impressive, so hopefully Wallman can rebound a little bit, especially as the Sharks build some confidence, hopefully, from this victory that they managed to get. When it comes to the second defensive pairing, we have Mario Ferraro and Jan Ruda. They kept together yet again. It feels as though at this point it's a broken record here that we're talking about how they probably should be separated. Warsofsky pretty much adamantly refusing to actually do so. I will say that I don't think that they were necessarily awful here tonight, but a couple of those shifts, especially on a couple of the goals that Utah did score, there were some massive problems. Ferraro continuing to just send pucks in areas of which he's not even looking to see if there are Sharks players there. There's just way too much kind of hopeful plays from these two players where they're kind of just behind the back passes or no look passes, thinking that, oh, maybe someone from the Sharks will be there, and it ends up just being a giveaway more often than not. That's something that needs to be cleaned up. That cannot be your first play out of the zone, and yet it happens more often than not. However, compared to, let's say, last game against the Vegas Golden Knights, where they were pummeled and really kept into their own zone for good chunks of the night, they were at least a little bit better, even with these major mistakes. And then when it comes to the third defensive pairing, we have Thrun paired with Matt Benning. So indeed, Jack Thompson taken out of the lineup here tonight. This is one of those things that I'm not exactly surprised to see it happen, because I do think Thompson wasn't great in the previous couple of games. I would have preferred Thompson to manage to maintain a spot, but I understand where Warsofsky is coming from. I would have, however, if it was up to me, brought Benning back in to see what he can do after a few games off, and just had Thompson replace Jan Ruda, especially since Thompson, as a little bit more of a puck mover, could help out Mario Ferraro, and then Thrun could end up playing with Benning still. That would have been my move, or at the very least put Ferraro with Benning if you truly want to maintain a no puck moving pairing, and then keep Thompson with Thrun. That could have definitely been the approach, but alas, not the case. Thompson gets the night off, and I actually thought this third pairing was okay. Matt Benning, a very, very quiet game, but that's honestly a good thing, considering Matt Benning was anything but quiet in the first few games of this season, where he was just a total disaster. So this was actually an improvement on that. And then when it comes to Henry Thrun, very up and down, kind of like I mentioned with Carl Grunstrom. There were some shifts where I was very impressed with what Thrun was able to do, especially in the earlier parts of this first period, but then his blown coverage on the Michelli first goal of this game, so that was when it made 2-0 Utah, was not impressive for him to be able to lose that battle to a player who honestly doesn't seem to be the strongest and biggest player on the ice. That was a little bit disappointing, but generally I don't think Thrun was the worst player on the ice for the Sharks, but definitely some work to be done. And then finally we have the Sharks goaltender Mackenzie Blackwood, who honestly wasn't all that great here tonight. He actually wasn't tasked with making all that many saves. As we got to the latter half of this game, Utah didn't really seem to be able to generate any sort of zone time or any sort of momentum here, as the Sharks were controlling the pace. So Blackwood didn't have to get tested all that much in the last 30 or so minutes of this one. However, in the earlier parts, Blackwood looked shaky at best. In terms of his rebound control, on many of these goals, he was just giving up these large rebounds that you simply need to be able to control. On the first one from Michelli, this is one he could be able to just deflect up high into the zone or into the corner, but instead it comes right in front of the net. Obviously, you put a little bit of blame on Thrun for not being able to win that battle, but there's got to be some blame on Blackwood for actually having set up that chance in the first place. And then on Michelli's second goal as well, a very similar situation, another huge rebound given up, and again it is blown coverage in front by the Sharks, but another situation where Blackwood needs to be able to control that rebound a little bit better. So while there weren't a ton of these goals where you're saying, okay, well, obviously that was a really, really soft one, it still comes down to him having to play a little bit better. But in the end, the Sharks, for once this season, bail him out and score enough goals to get the victory here. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow, so not a lot of time to celebrate this one. However, the Sharks finally back at home. I talked about potential call-ups occurring as the Sharks will finally arrive back in San Jose. We'll see what ends up happening in that regard. And the Sharks will be facing off against the Los Angeles Kings, who it was just a few games ago that they actually lost to, though it was a close one. And we'll see if the Sharks can keep the good times rolling. Class dismissed.